Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and I have a special guest today. Nicole Sackage and I are doing a panel this coming weekend on triangle sightings. And I had heard from a good friend of mine, Peter Robbins, to invite Linda Zimmermann on to talk about the Hudson Valley sightings and the triangle cases that occurred there. And I'm honored to have her on this morning. So welcome, Linda, and thanks for joining me to talk about one of the many books that you've written. Maybe detail a little bit. You do a lot of ghost books, but you've done 4 UFO books, and you've done, I think, 3 books on the Hudson Valley sightings. Is that correct?
Yes, first of all, thanks for having me. Always happy to talk about the Hudson Valley. Yes, I have 3 UFO books all about the Hudson Valley sightings, which really stretch back 100 years. In the Night Sky, Hudson Valley UFOs, and more Hudson Valley UFOs.
Beautiful. And so is this the kind of work I used to be friends with Bob Pratt from the National Enquirer, and he and J. Allen Hynek had done the original book. Is that correct on the Hudson Valley stuff?
Yes, excellent book, Night Siege. That is a definite must read, which concentrates on those 1980s sightings, which tens of thousands of people witnessed.
And so how do you get into, you're doing mostly ghost books, but how do you get into the UFO thing, and why the Hudson Valley? Are you live in that area?
Yeah, born and raised here. I've lived here my entire life and had my own sightings here. And when I was growing up, it just seemed natural to have UFO sightings because they were so prevalent. And anytime I'd give a lecture, either, a paranormal lecture or local history, people would always come up and give me their UFO stories. And my standard line for many years, like, well, that's interesting, but I don't do UFOs. I had no plans on that. And then one day, this woman came up and told me this story that just, a jaw dropping story. And I said, if even half of this is true, I think it's time I start doing UFOs. So that's it's just the nature of this area. It just seems to never end with the sightings people have had.
So let's get into the different types of sightings, and particularly maybe do a little um, start off on how triangles fit in, and how you figure there are different types of sightings. So you have triangle sightings, you have circular sightings. What was Hudson Valley? Was it mostly triangle stuff, or?
It was, yeah, we lump it into triangles, but it was triangles, V-shaped, and they call them kind of boomerang. That was, I would throw a number out there, probably 80% of the sightings during the Hudson Valley wave. However, there were disc-shaped craft and very unusual shaped. One man said the thing he saw looked like a Norelco razor, with those little 3 swirling blades. So there is a variety, but the vast majority were massive triangles, at least the size of a football field, completely silent, so low that they looked like they were brushing treetop level. And these were not things that whooshed through the sky. These were things people stood beneath for as long as 20 minutes at a time. So those are really the hallmarks, the proximity, the duration, and this lasted for at least 6 years.
Wow. Were you involved at the time, or did you pick it up after the story had sort of settled down and people came to you?
Yeah, I was had a job in a lab. I was a research scientist, and of course I'd hear it on the news and see it in the newspaper. And I had my own sighting in '88 of a large V-shaped craft, perfectly silent, and I was fascinated by it. But I was working in the lab at that point and had no plans of writing UFO books. But we know where life takes us, right?
Were these like the you mentioned the size of them? Were they like the Phoenix lights where they had the different types of lighting formations on them, or like the Belgium ones where they have them in the corners? The one I saw one at 76, which had the lights in the corners. So what was the light structures on the ones that you were?
All of the above. Predominantly, it was one red light, one white light in each corner, and a red light in the center. But there were cases where one witness described it was a city of lights. And I've seen some of the artists' renditions, and massive triangles, I mean, literally lit up like Christmas trees. They were so bright, all different colors. And people would often say there were colors I had never seen before. You know, when you hear the 37th person saying that, you know, you pay attention. And then there were those that were completely dark, no lights whatsoever, and maybe the only way they saw it was some sort of other ambient light, or the fact that a triangular black shape was blocking out the stars as it moved along.
Wow. So what was this before the Belgium? What's the age or the time frame that we're talking here?
If you put a number on it, it would be from New Year's Eve 1982, so just at the beginning really of 83, basically through 88, 89. That was the most intense part of the wave. Of course, there were triangles going back to the 60s and this year. But the ones where any, you know, the Phoenix Lights is a phenomenal case. But I always say, well, that was kind of a typical night of the week for 6 years here. And it's just so remarkable that so many people I run into who are even interested in this field, they're like, well, how come I never heard of it? How did, you know, it's kind of a forgotten wave in some ways. And in others, I think it's the most impressive I can think of, in this country, at least.
So you're saying this was basically going on every night? Was the media on it talking about it, or deal with that, and then maybe deal with whether the government was involved?
Well, certainly there was a lot of media coverage, and very early on, it was clear the police did not want to deal with this. They didn't want their switchboards jammed up when there might be other emergencies. So they came up with the excuse that it was formations of planes. And there was a group, they called themselves the Martians. They had yes, they had a sense of humor. They had Cessna single engine planes. They were flying out of Stormville Airport. And usually on Thursday nights, they would get together. They might put some extra lights on their planes and try to fly around in formation. There was also an ultralight, if you're familiar with ultralight aircraft, which are those very flimsy little things, which are illegal to fly after dark, but they were doing that otherwise anyway. And so the standard excuse, if no matter what you saw, if you saw a triangle that was 200 feet wide, you know, 50 feet above you, and you called to report it, the police, the airports would say it was a formation of planes, of small planes. I have no proof of this, but the FAA and the powers that be in the government had to have given at least tacit approval to this, because it got everybody out of their hair, and it just was a convenient excuse, but clearly absurd. Most people who saw the giant triangle silent, as well as the hoaxing pilot, said there was no comparison.
Well, what's the sort of the actual area? Is this just New York State, or give me the sort of the impression on how big the area was that these sightings were taking place in?
Mostly the lower Hudson Valley, which would reach from New York City, not quite up to Albany. It's a 100-mile stretch, but the the concentration of the activity was probably within a 30-40 mile radius. Anybody familiar with New York, Hudson Valley area, Rockland, Orange, Putnam, Dutchess, Westchester, the lower counties. However, Western Connecticut, Danbury area, um, many of the sightings either began in Western Connecticut and continued that night into Eastern New York, or vice versa. So when you look at it on a map, you say, well, that's a pretty big area, but one of these sightings could go over 10, 12 different towns, hover over major highways in two different states in the same night. So these were not generally, Mr. Smith in his backyard saw something. This was 5,000 people on major highways and fairly populated suburban towns, where everything was within an hour of New York City. So a fairly substantial population.
And were these high up or low down, or did they have certain things that they were doing that you mentioned sitting above highways and stuff?
They were so low. I had one man say that if he had a baseball, he could have hit it.
Wow.
Another one said he could have hit it with a tennis ball. People thought that they were going to actually crush the trees. They were so low over the trees. And yet one very good observer said it was just at treetop level, but the leaves never moved, which I thought was an interesting observation. So it wasn't, any exhaust or disturbance in the air. So these were so close. I mean, I can't imagine something the size of a football field, at the height of your maple tree in your front yard. One of the most chilling descriptions was a woman in the Danbury area, the mid 80s. She said the entire sky was metal and lights.
Wow.
And if that doesn't put it in perspective.
The Phoenix Lights, there was not much discussion about fear. What were people's reactions there? Was there varying reactions of awe and fear, or what were the people responding to this?
There were people so terrified and traumatized to this day. They're, 35 years later, they're frightened to go outside by themselves.
Wow.
There are others who were so awestruck. There was this one family in particular. They said to me, we felt honored. We felt gratitude at sighting this. And they said they put their chairs out on their deck every summer evening to this day, again, 20, 30 years later, because they want to experience it. So many people felt a psychic, some sort of connection with these objects.
Wow. I'll ask you about that a little bit later, the sort of the connection. What did Hynek think about this? What was his conclusion? He worked on this. John Hynek, who was the sort of the main government researcher.
Well, he was so impressed. He came and, visited many of the witnesses. I've talked to a couple who, he came to dinner to Hynek wanted to really get to know these people. And from what they have told me, he thought this was one of the best documented, most genuine, and also in terms of the quality of the witnesses. He said, we have IBM executives and Air Force personnel and military and doctors and, police officers. He was very, very impressed with the sheer number and the quality of these witnesses.
Why do you think that it hasn't gotten the attention, maybe like the Phoenix Lights? Have you thought about that in terms of, like, people seem to know the Belgian one and they seem to know the Phoenix Lights one, but the Hudson Valley, which is, how many sightings would there have been in total, that you just to guesstimate?
Days of sightings, there had to be hundreds. Wow. Because I would say easily once or twice a week for 6 years. I mean, do even if on a low estimate, once a week for 6 years, you're talking, 300 or plus sightings. Um, why I believe it did not get the attention was that very aggressive disinformation campaign. Um, Years ago, I think it was the UFO Congress that you and I had adjoining tables at about 8 years. I was talking to somebody about it, and they said, "Why are you even bothering with this subject? It was a formation of Cessna planes." And you restrain,
Yeah.
grabbing him around the neck. You said, it, because that's the, they hear that you can have 100 valid witnesses, but if you have one person with a loud voice and some authority, a police person or something, saying, no, it's all a hoax and everybody knows it, that just deflates and suppresses the whole thing.
Wow. Um, what about researchers? Were there researchers working on it, say from the New York, MUFON, and Connecticut, and those groups? Was there any people on the ground trying to document this, other than Hynek and Bob Pratt?
Yes, definitely. I'm not sure about the New York MUFON people, but I know Connecticut MUFON. Some great papers were written. I know there was one in particular with the one with just I think it was a 2 week period. Somebody wrote, this thick report where he went to every location where it was seen, got every witness he could. Um, Really tremendous work. There's still a lot of work out there. I am currently trying to find out where the papers and audio tapes are of, he was a police lieutenant and had been investigating for 30 years or so, and he worked with Hynek and Pratt, and a lot of the information in the Night Siege book was from his interviews. Unfortunately, he's passed away. I'm speaking with his son, trying to find out if his material, because his son said he had boxes and boxes of cassette tape interviews. So there are still treasure troves out there.
So you might even do a fourth book. Name your first three books, the ones that you did on the Hudson Valley. Give the names of the books so people, and they can get them at Amazon, right?
Yes, the first one was In the Night Sky, and that is a whole comprehensive look about. I have the skeptics, the hoaxing pilots, the triangles. I have everything, and then Hudson Valley UFOs, which is a continuation. But I start pushing the envelope back to the early 1900s, to the mysterious airship wave we had here, and then more Hudson Valley UFOs, which is again a continuation. When I have the time, I think what I need to do is combine them all, make one big, not quite the Encyclopedia Britannica, but one big hefty volume of a reference. And plus I easily have enough for a fourth book, but I'd like to, put these all together so you have a chapter on every triangle sighting, that I have covered, and so on.
You mentioned the airwave. I wasn't aware that you had the airwave sightings. Describe a little bit about what years that was with the 1890s, I guess you're talking, and what kind of objects were being seen in that area.
What our airship sightings were about 1908 to 1910.
Huh.
In this Hudson Valley, 1909, uh, they were seeing, if it was very rare to see them during the day, but they seemed to be somewhat cylindrical. At night, what they were seeing was something that seemed to be very long, with almost like a bright spotlight at each end. And the characteristics were they could hover for long periods of time, they could move extremely fast, and again, they had these very bright spotlights. They were seen sometimes for as long as 4 hours, going from town to town throughout the Hudson Valley, branching out into New England. And actually, I don't know if you're very familiar with Quebec,
Yeah.
the Quaticook Valley
Oh,
had a huge wave of sightings during that period. And I love to plot things out, and you can just see where these concentrations were. And in 1909, no planes were flying at night.
yeah.
They didn't have lights because there was no reason to put on a light. And plus, a lot of them were stick and fabric. You would need, if you're putting a huge two bright spotlights, you can imagine the battery weight.
The power you'd need to power those lights. Yeah, you're right.
Exactly. And that went on for a couple of years. And, today people say it was mass hysteria or whatever. I have read hundreds of newspaper reports. Not one person thought it was somebody from Mars or Venus. They thought the Wright brothers or Thomas Edison was not far working. His labs were probably 45 minutes away from the Hudson Valley. They thought, oh, this has to be something Thomas Edison has developed. And any day now, he's going to announce it.
Wow.
And the months and years passed, and no, we've never found blueprints, prototypes,
Yeah.
nothing.
If you're looking, you've plotted all these over, say, over a century or more. Is there any sort of pattern that sticks out? Like why, like 1909, 1910? Why the 1980s? Is there any sort of thing that correlates in terms of things happening, or
In terms of world events or events in the
why
area?
that particular period? Why? What was the interest? Because the where I got it started was 75 in Manitoba, and they had built a nuclear anti-ballistic missile unit on the other side of the border when we had ours here. And I'm just wondering if you thought through all your research what was going, like even the 1890s, there was the idea that there was the internal combustion engine had been developed. You must have thought about that. Why the time? What were they doing? What was this all about?
Well, certainly we were in our infancy with aviation. We didn't have anything as good as a Zeppelin, but people were trying these dirigibles. There were daytime flights. So certainly that if someone was looking down on us, they're hey, look, this species is leaving the ground now. So that's certainly 1909, certainly fits into that period. Why the 1980s? I'm not sure. We have a nuclear power plant called Indian Point, which so much activity was centered around. So, but it had been there, for a decade or more before this wave. So I wish I could say, well, this A happened, that's why B then happened, but
What about beings like in the early wave of the 20th century or in the 1980s? Was there beings that were being reported?
No, the only beings were, I think, when in the early 1890s sightings, you heard about people having conversations with, they were regular people, it seemed like. But in the Hudson Valley, not a single ET type of nothing. Nobody ever spoke or saw any figures whatsoever, and no landings either.
Wow, that's similar to Phoenix. It's almost like it's duplicating that, where there was no abduction. Well, I guess there would be abduction reports, but you couldn't compare it. What was the comparison in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to make that clear. What I was just saying had to do with the airship wave.
Oh,
With
okay,
the
okay.
wave of the 1980s, the abductions were the biggest chapter in my first book and continue to be quite numerous. It was rampant, missing time abductions, abductions that would go on for days, weeks, months. There was one man, a very high ranking elected official. One night, his dog is going crazy and he thinks he wants to go out. He opens the sliding doors to the backyard. Dog won't go out. He kind of pushes the dog out, and the dog curls up in a little ball and is whimpering. And then he realizes he had this strange feeling, and he looks up and hears this black triangle with a few lights directly over him. From that night, he was seeing a classic gray and another figure with a large white head with big eyes, basically several times a week for months, to the point where he almost had a nervous breakdown. He was having profuse bleeding from his nose. He finally went to a doctor who put one of those scopes up
Yeah.
to look. And the doctor's first question is, well, who's been operating on you? And he said, nobody. He goes, no, that's not right. Somebody's been cutting, doing something up there. So he finally had to move, and fortunately the activity did not continue. But that, again, is a hallmark of the 1980s, these intense, prolonged experiences.
Are these people still around in terms of like, especially the people who've had the abduction experience? Are they still having encounters? Are you in contact with all these people?
I try to regularly check up and on them. I cannot recall the last time one of them has said they've had a recent experience. For the most part, they seem to have ended. There, caveat there was one woman who had her first experience in 1937.
Wow.
And in her 80s, not too many years ago, she said that she was seeing these gray-like figures were still coming to her where she lived, but not an abduction. She didn't think she was being an abduction. It just seemed to be a check-in, should we say. But the intense, I'm not saying no one isn't getting abducted now, but for the most part, when the main part of the wave ended, that part ended as well.
Was it strictly hybrid stuff, or was there messages or anything like that combined with what people were experiencing?
Again, so varied. Some people, they thought it was a wonderful experience, and that who these beings helped them physically, spiritually. Others, they just felt completely violated and tortured, and are still traumatized as a result. On the one extreme, I've had people tell me, if I knew they were coming, I'd stand out there right now and say, take me again.
Yeah.
And there was one man who said, if I had a gun and they were here, I'd shoot every single one of them.
Wow. You mentioned before somebody passing away in the files and stuff like that. Question for you: was Lawrence Rockefeller involved? There was sort of a rumor that this is sort of what got him inspired to go down that road. And for you, just a sort of a heads up, I believe his files are there. I don't know if anybody's ever looked at his files. And so was he involved in this?
I do not know, but I am going to be on this immediately. If there is anything in his files, I would absolutely love to know about it.
Yeah, because I think they're at Princeton, I think is where he got his degree. They're with all the other Rockefeller files, but I mean, he had a tremendous amount of material, and he was doing it all in the background. And it's one of those things, with the family where they wouldn't really know what's significant and what's not significant. And unless they destroyed all the UFO stuff, I mean, it's just a catch that if it happens to be there, that's an incredible, because he dealt with so many powerful people, the Clintons and stuff like that, and he had that very big interest in the UFO thing. What was the best? Say, give me a couple of the best cases that you thought were just like wow when they told you through this period of the Hudson Valley thing.
The two of the earliest cases from March 17th and March 24th, 83. The first one, you may have seen him on Unsolved Mysteries, Dennis Sant. He had a tremendous story. He's coming home with his kids in Brewster, New York, and he sees, again, what he described as a city of lights hovering over the highway adjacent to his house. And he said he wished he could get a better look. And with that, the craft moved directly over his backyard. And it was just absolutely enormous. Neighbors described seeing Dennis and his family standing there bathed in light. And it was a real transformative experience for him. In addition to him and his neighbors, hundreds of people stopped their cars on Route 84, which is a major highway. You don't want to stop your, I don't know where you are or what the equivalent is. You don't want to stop your car in the middle of a highway and get out, but that's what people were doing. And as remarkable as this was, with it, I think they estimate 3,000 witnesses, it happened again 1 week later. Three of my favorite witnesses are these three teachers who were coming back from graduate classes, and the Taconic Parkway, which is where a lot of activity happened. All these cars were stopped, so they stopped and got out. And this craft, enormous, silent, very brightly lit up, they stood beneath it, directly beneath it, at treetop level for 20 solid minutes.
Wow.
And I'm sure witnesses have told you about life-altering experiences, seeing a craft for 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Can you imagine 20 solid minutes?
Yeah.
So they were great. All of them were great witnesses. And those back-to-back weeks, that was the kickoff really to the wave. Another one that really impressed me was as late as 1995 in a town called Howells, a little small town. Man was going to take out the garbage. Where would we be without people taking cigarette breaks or walking the dog? So he's taking out the garbage, and his mother had installed a very bright spotlight, kind of sideways, not pointing down, to point to the end of the driveway. So the light was going upwards. And had that light not been there, he said he never would have seen this craft, huge, triangular, the size of 3 football fields.
Wow.
He said it was moving at a pretty good clip, but even with that, it took a considerable number of seconds to pass by. And he said he could see great detail, but again, absolutely silent. Had that light not been on, he doesn't think he would have even noticed it.
Were there anybody that got photos? Were there people, say, trying to get them, or did anybody accidentally get a photo of this?
There was a boy in a photo club at his local high school in that March 24th, 1983 case. He comes out of his photography meeting and he sees this brightly lit triangle, takes a couple of photos of it, and you can clearly see it's very brightly lit, large triangle, and it seems to be a beam of light beaming down, illuminating the ground, low to the ground. And it was published in the newspaper. And I cold call him several years ago, we're talking 30 some odd years later. And I said, "Are you the Jeff Salmonese who took that photo?"
Yeah.
And there's silence. And he's like, "Wow, is that a blast from the past?" He said, "Why are you interested?" And I said, "Well, it's probably the best photo taken from that wave." He said, "Well, but the police told me it was a formation of ultralights, so I never paid any more attention."
Wow.
So there were probably a lot more photos that got the same treatment, and it didn't even make it as far as the newspapers.
I want to ask you a little bit about the connection to other paranormal phenomena, but first let me get you to sum up in your research on UFOs. Have you got any sort of overall theory as to what might be going on, or why this is going on, or what we're dealing with here?
Well, I will go on the record, and I do think they're extraterrestrial. I know a lot of people don't want to say that. I think, and I'm sure there could be interdimensional. I mean, everything is wide open, but what I do not think over the past 100 years is that it's our government making stealth. I think we can shelve that. Could there be things that are misconstrued now? Absolutely. I'm sure we have some amazing technology. But that's why, like, that airship wave was so important. It set the precedent. This isn't you. This isn't us. This is them,
Somebody else.
whoever them are. And I would think they're very curious. As I said, I used to work in a lab, and if you're trying to study something, you like studying generations of, rats or mice or whatever. Whatever you're testing, you test it through several generations. And that sure sounds like what's been going on here, because multi-generational abductions are really, I don't want to say common, but they are certainly not uncommon.
Now, what was I going to ask? In terms of the other thing, you'll see they're going to Senate now. They're trying to get money for research, whatever, and they're using the threat scenario. Did you, in all the material you've seen, do you buy into the thing that these things may be a threat to us?
On a personal level, for those who have been traumatized, yes. In terms of all out warfare, I think if they were a serious threat, we'd be toast long ago.
My assistant Nicole is actually sort of sitting in the background. She's joined us now, but she had a question, and I think you've already answered it. But in terms of the early airship wave, there was no beings reported, correct? It was just
None.
these things, and
Right.
it went on for how many years? 2 years.
I'd say a good 2 years, yes.
And you got these reports out of newspapers and stuff like that? I mean, it's pretty
Yes.
impressive if you were getting stuff out of Quebec, because that would all be in French and stuff. And how many sightings did you catalog in the early airship wave?
Um, there had again, it there had to be dozens. I don't know if I'd say a full 100, but there had to be dozens reported. But there was a airship wave in part of that was in Worcester, Massachusetts, where around Christmas time, where could have been 10,000 people out on the street seeing it. So in terms of the number of witnesses, we are easily in the tens of thousands.
Wow. And that's in your early book, the airship wave. Do you do that in your first book, second, or third book?
No, I didn't discover that until the second book. So that's,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then I expand upon it in the third book.
That's pretty significant. I agree with you. And I always point out to people, because you've been in it a long time, I've been in it a long time, and people seem to think that whatever's happening now always happened. And I'm saying, no, it's completely different. It's like they're almost like they're turning the pages of a book, and they, even the thing, maybe you can talk about this thing about the difference between so circular crafts and triangle crafts. I mean, it's like in the early years there was no triangle crafts, or not many, and then suddenly you get this sort of wave of giant mile-wide triangle crafts flying, at treetop level across major population areas.
Yeah, in a nutshell, the shapes of craft, I think we started, well, we don't know the shape in the airship wave, but 40s, 50s, the flying saucer, the
Yeah.
disc. Also cylinders, cylindrical, cigar shaped. I heard a lot of in the 50s, 60s, and still a couple today. And then we had another bit of a wave in the 70s with discs. And then the 80s and 90s were definitely the decades of the triangle. And we still see triangles, but starting around 2012, 2013, massive rectangular craft. Same characteristics, there'll be a white light in each corner, red light in the center, football field size. It's same craft, different shape, it seems to be now.
as you probably know, I made a move away from the UFO thing into consciousness. So I want to get into your work in other paranormal fields. And you've done ghost books. How many ghost books have you done?
Uh, 16, 17, something like that. Yeah, that was not anything I had planned. As I said, I was a research scientist, and they closed our lab. And while everybody else was going out looking for other lab jobs, I said, I really want to write. And I just fell into I was trying to do history, and people kept asking about ghost stories. And once I started investigating on my own, I went down that rabbit hole hard and fast, and have not come up for air yet. To me, and I have to confess, I resisted when people said, "Well, UFOs and ghosts, it's all the same thing. There's a connection, isn't there?" And I'm like, "No, there's no connection." But I'm seeing places like Pine Bush, New York, which they call the UFO capital of the Northeast. Also, you cannot throw a frisbee without hitting a house that isn't haunted. And they have, you name the kind of high strangeness, they have it. And so many witnesses I interview will have UFO, an intense UFO experience, and then start having poltergeist like activity, or at least sensitivity to ghostly activity. And I don't know if it's just expanding your brain in making you more sensitive. One makes you more sensitive to the other, or I don't know. I'll leave that to you. What do you think is the underlying connection?
Well, to me, it's always the consciousness thing that, like, for example, you'll talk. I sort of got into the thing, and you may have been into this. Was the thing with the apports or manifestations and apports, things moving around in the house, where I didn't know that, and then I suddenly got an experiencer who claimed they'd had an encounter with the beings, and then I would start asking them the question like, "Do you ever have anything fall out of the ceiling or move around?" And then they'd say, "Can I go to the next room?" And they'd come back with a whole collection full of stuff.
Oh, wow.
And it was this thing where a lot of people, when you talk to them, like for example, like you had that experience where someone says, "Well, no, I don't think I was really dealing. I just have dreams about them, whatever." And then my next question is always, "Anything else weird happened in your life?" And they go, "Oh yeah, I had a near death experience and this and that." And they start, and it's almost like they're magnets for this kind of stuff, that around the UFO thing, you'll see that where people are seeing orbs, and people sort of parse them that it's not connected. And
Mhm.
so when because I've always been sort of interested in paranormal stuff, I was not never interested in UFOs until I had the sighting when I just sort of fell off the edge of the earth. But I was interested in Edgar Casey, and you'll find that as well, that people are into that sort of stuff. But that's why I was sort of interested in the ghost thing, because to me, it's like if you're interested in UFOs, you're probably going to be interested in ghosts, and you're going to see significant things in both cases. Give me a couple of the best ghost stories out of your 16 books that you've done in terms of,
Wow.
or are
One
there
of
any real famous places that people may not know that are haunted by ghosts?
Um, well, these days people advertise it, to draw in people. But I stayed at the Lizzie Borden house, and I had footsteps walking up to my door. I watched the old-fashioned door latch. I watched it raise, the door swung open, and there was nobody there. That made an impression. Um, I had probably my best photograph, and the one I absolutely can't explain. There was a pretty nasty character who had this house, and let's say was known for experimenting on women. He was a bad character, and it was such a terrible, evil haunting there, and he would manifest as this dark, hunched over figure. And I was on an investigation, and I saw something moving in the room, snapped a few infrared photos. And when I get home, I put it on the computer, and there's this dark, hunched over photo. And it just made my, image, it just made my blood run cold, because I was the only thing in the person in the room. So certainly cases like that. Um, cases where I've actually been able to find out who and what and why. Um, I do bring a psychic. I've, I don't go in as a psychic, but when you do 300 or 400 investigations, you hone that a bit. And I have gotten images of people and names, and in later research found out they existed and they had a connection to that place, maybe died in that place. So certainly that has opened up uh, my idea of consciousness in all this as well.
Wow. Um, in terms of the ghost thing, what's your impression? Is it like someone dies and they leave an energy pattern that can be picked up by other people, or what's your interpretation of what's actually going on? Is it actually spirits, or is it just energy forms of stuff that people have left behind?
A few seem to just be residual energies, but the majority that I have dealt with are, I will use the term conscious entities, conscious spirits, who either seem to be confused, it was some sort of sudden death and they don't realize they're gone, but predominantly, I would say 75% easily is some unresolved issue, some emotional hook that keeps them locked into that place. They died with some sort of regret. They died tragically. They died angry, wanting something so bad. And it's like they just won't let that go and move on to wherever they might move on to. But that's my take on it. Um, they just need to let go.
And you would be the authority because you've done a lot of books. Your website, I noticed on your website that you actually sell autographed copies, that you will ship them out. So maybe give people a link on that, because you've done 30 plus books, um, and you've got a lot of knowledge, especially in the field of ghosts. So give people the link where they can find that.
Sure. My website is www.gotozim.com. That's GOTOZIM.com. And all of my books and ebooks are Amazon, iTunes, all, if they want to get the ebook versions. But sure, I'd be happy to do the autographed. But if we have a moment on, if I love the subject of consciousness, I've been meditating twice a day for about 44 years now.
Oh, right. You're the
And
first then.
and somebody years ago, I was at some meditation retreat and the subject of UFOs came up, and he was some older man, just seemed very wise. And his take on this was that these other beings are here because they're studying our ability to transcend, that we have the ability to work on our consciousness, refine it, and transcend to higher levels, and they can't.
Oh, is that right?
That,
Wow.
take it for what it is. I just got goosebumps when I said that. That to me has, it feels right to some degree. You'll often hear abductees talking about these almost automaton type grays, or you know just
Yeah.
just not very soulful beings. So I don't know how you feel about that idea, but I just like it. I just feel, I feel comfortable. I was like, yeah, I'd like to think we have something they're envious of and want to study it.
Yeah. In terms of your own development, I mean, what have you learned from 40 years of meditation for people who have heard about it but really don't know whether this is some road they should go down? Have you gained a lot by that? And a related question is synchronicities. Do you believe you have some sort of mission where you're sort of being guided by higher self, or something where things just seem to fall into place at the right time?
Well, certainly the whole UFO field fell in my lap, as did the ghost field. I wasn't looking for it, and it just happened, and people would keep contacting me with their story. People would actually send me their house keys in the mail saying, we're going away for a week. Could you, if you want to investigate our house? I'm like, how did this happen? I mean, so certainly I'm not saying a higher being is guiding me, but certainly being in the right place at the right time. In terms of my own spiritual development, I could not have survived this last 40 years without it. It's the core of my being. I would, if tomorrow I was told, well, you're going away and you're going to be in a room in yourself and meditate the rest of your life. Okay. I we'll put food and water by your door and you can just be blissfully transcendent, day and night. It is my oasis twice a day, if not more so. And that is where I live and breathe.
Wow, fantastic. And in terms of the UFO community, you probably know that a lot of UFO researchers don't want the woo-woo stuff. They don't want the consciousness stuff. They want the nuts and the bolts. Just give me the engine and we're going to make some money. And what's the technology and all this kind of stuff. So do you see a link, or how do you see consciousness in terms of, because you've been at it longer than me. I had a noetic experience, as you probably know, that led me there. I made the joke, in 2012, I couldn't have spelled consciousness. I couldn't have cared less. And so I had that, but you've been at it a long time. So what would you say in terms of, is there a connection of consciousness to the UFO phenomena?
Absolutely, there is. I'm not saying there aren't nuts and bolts, but whoever is behind, who's ever turning those nuts and bolts, um, has some sort of link consciously. And I have just seen way too many witnesses who've had their consciousness expanded significantly after an intense experience. It there's no question of it. And yes, so there's a lot of noise in this field. No, it has to be interdimensional. No, it has to be nuts and bolts. It can be everything, and all of it connected. And I mean, who are we to rule out any possibility?
Yeah, one thing I've always brought up is the fact that it's going to be probably 1,000 times more complex than people think it is. Like, people think, oh, we've got it all figured out now. And I think you would agree with me, when you start looking at the cases,
Mhm.
and you start realizing, like, wow, I mean, they can do this, they can do that. It's just like,
Mhm.
you just realize you're like a grain of sand on a beach in terms of understanding what's actually going on here.
Yeah, and my latest book was actually an offspring of all my Hudson Valley work, is animal
Yeah, I
reactions to
forgot to bring that up.
UFOs.
Yeah. So talk to me about
Um,
animal reactions, because I had one of my first cases involved horses that people said, oh, no, this,
oh,
this crop circle was hoaxed. No, no, it was hoaxed or whatever. And all I could remember was, go talk to the guy across the street. His horses went absolutely insane. And then I knew, oh, there's something to this. You can say whatever you want about the crop circle, because I knew the connection. They didn't know the connection between the animals. So talk a little bit about animal reactions in terms of UFOs, because that's your latest book. And then go to your next book. What are you planning next?
well, the animal reactions, as I was interviewing people, so many of the cases started like the one I was telling you about, the man with his dog going, and that's how he saw. So, and I, at one point I was joking, we wouldn't have half these cases if the dogs or the horses or the cows didn't alert the people. They seem to know before a craft or an event occurs. They have much stronger reactions, like those horses in the crop circles. If there'd been a landing, they won't go near it day, week, maybe forever. And so what I do is I go through all the potential, I try to look at it a little, somewhat scientifically. Well, obviously it's their hearing, it's their sense of smell. I think their magnetoreception, the so many animals use the Earth's magnetic field to navigate, to, orient themselves. And clearly these craft or whatever they are have electromagnetic interference effects. So I take cases from around the world for decades and show how they relate to the different possibilities. And I just think it's such an overlooked aspect. People have done little catalogs of animal reactions here or there, but kind of treated them almost as a curiosity. Well, that's an interesting aspect, but what does it really mean? I think it means a whole lot. And I think we can learn a lot by those dogs and horses and cats, you name the animal, seems to react to these things all in the same ways. So that just came out 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to take a breath, and then what I really need to do, as I said, is combine those three, my first three Hudson Valley books, and add the other 100 cases or whatever it is I have to it. I want there to be a Hudson Valley reference, that all of the um, airship sightings through the the current time, and here's the triangles, here's the discs, here's the abductions, and I'm hoping once people see how unbelievably intense, how often this has happened over how many generations, hopefully the Hudson Valley will gain in people's consciousness, let's say.
Wow. And any more ghost books planned, or you still? I guess you still got people bringing you stories on that field as well.
Right. With COVID, haven't done any investigations this year, nothing planned, but certainly I have enough material for that as well. But the UFO field has kind of seduced me away.
And as an author, and I've talked to people like Preston Dennett, people like that who've done Nick Redfern, who've done piles of books. A lot of people in the UFO community, when they have an experience like a very dramatic sort of UFO encounter that goes over years, I always say to them, "Did you write this down?" And they go, "Well, no." And I said, "You should write this down." So for as aspiring people who have what I consider to be history, that you're here almost like the time of Jesus or the signing of the Constitution, like it's a very important time that you got to be the first person to experience this. How would you advise people who say, "Well, I really can't write a book," or "I don't know"? As an author, do you encourage people to try to get it out? And how do you do the writing? Because you're doing a lot of books. Is there any sort of secrets you can give them into getting over that hump and starting the book?
Yes, in fact, I have a great example. The witness, Dennis Sant, who had that city of lights over his backyard, he would tell the most incredible stories about his experience. And then I'd say, "Dennis, you need to write a book." "I can't write." I said, "No, but you can talk." I said, "Get yourself one of those headsets and talk to your computer. Tell the computer the story you just told me, and it will write it all down." And his book is coming out this week.
Oh, fantastic.
So yes, everybody can talk. Get it on recording. If you can't stand the thought of typing, hire somebody to transcribe your thoughts, or talk to somebody who does know how to write to at least, help you through, because the material is there. They have the experience. No one can tell a UFO story like someone who's experienced it. And we couldn't do what we do without those stories. So I absolutely encourage people to put them out themselves.
Beautiful. Okay, is there anything else you wanted to maybe get out, or otherwise I'd like to bring up again the Rockefeller thing, and if you go for the files, and you can't find them or whatever, I at one time located them, but I think that would be fascinating, especially you're a writer who can get it out. I think that I am pretty sure that's a gold mine of stuff, unless the family, because the family didn't like his involvement, unless he
Mhm.
destroyed that stuff. I mean, that's an incredible gold mine that nobody's ever gone after.
Yeah, I am so on that. I can't wait. You're lucky I'm not dialing the phone now. I actually was lucky enough to do some archival research at Princeton on a Civil War book I was writing years ago, and what a wonderful institution. So if I can get back there and what, I don't care how long it takes. I will sit and go through every page if that's, and you will be, I will have you on speed dialed.
Beautiful.
If,
And you mentioned other books. Is there other books that you've done? Because you mentioned the Civil War. When you brought it up, then I remember seeing that. But you've done UFO books, ghost books, and some history books. You wanted to be a historian or do history.
yeah, I always was fascinated by history. So I do have a couple of Civil War books, some histories of the local area I live in. One book that I'm very proud of is called Bad Science.
Oh yeah,
It's,
I never asked you
yeah,
about that. Yeah, I wanted to
yeah.
ask you. Okay, so what? Because I was going to do a similar book, and Stanton did a book with Kathy Martin in that
Hmm.
vein. I spent a lot of time now sort of mocking science for some of the stuff that they come up, because everybody always assumes that if you got a PhD, you're a real smart guy, and I always said my best job I ever had was when I was very young. I worked in the faculty club bar at the University of Manitoba, and I
Hmm.
got to know every academic. And I said, they're just like other people. And that was the warning they gave me. When these guys have had one too many beers, they're just like anybody on the street. Don't get intimidated by these guys. And I've never been intimidated by people with PhDs, because I realized they've been very smart in one small little tiny area. So give me a couple of examples of things in science that are totally messed up, that because people end up believing all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Oh, pick a topic. I had initially written bad astronomy because, the whole history where all the planets are on these gears and there's an angel turning a crank to move the universe. And when some observational data disproved it, well, obviously we need to add more gears. It wasn't let's get rid of the gears and spheres, let's add more. And so much to do that. Medicine, absolutely horrific. Bleeding. George Washington was essentially bled to death. They bled more than half of his volume
Wow.
of blood because he had a cold.
Wow.
And that people are still bleeding to this day. Um, the, and of course then there are hoaxers, but modern, there was one terrible case where the pressure on these people to get grants, who are the PhDs who live on grant money. um, this one man was at a very prestigious university doing a study of heart medications on dogs, and somebody observed him injecting the dogs, then going back to his desk and filling out 3 weeks worth of data. Well, he just injected them. Um, and the storm of controversy. So then everybody who came in contact with this man throughout his career had that taint on them. They always, once they're caught, I've never done this before. No, you never got caught before. So, yeah, people do have this idea that the Lord High PhDs and physicians, so I kind of irreverently expose the dirty underbelly of and going back centuries.
Yeah, because we used to call them a PhD was piled higher and deeper, and
I
we
was
and we used to have the thing, because we knew a lot of these people that you get a bachelor's degree and then you're in school, you really don't want to go to get a job or whatever, and you say, oh, I'll get a master's degree and I'll get more money, and then when you got the master's degree, you've got no experience, nobody wants to hire you, and then what are you going to do? It's like, oh, I got a PhD and I'll teach it, and people don't realize how many times that happens where they're like,
absolutely.
a lot of students that I had that I met that had 2 PhDs and had never had a job, and they were like permanent students things. You gave this lecture. It's a pretty popular topic. Maybe you can we can do something on science, because I think you gave a lecture at Mensa or something, and there was like 100 people couldn't get in the room. So this science thing is a big topic. It's very popular. I didn't realize.
It was out in Portland at the National Mensa Convention several years ago, and fights almost broke out trying to get in the room. It was packed so full. Because if you've ever been to any of the Mensa events, we're a dysfunctional group who has a great sense of humor, and so we love poking fun at ourselves and science. But any chance I can do a bad science presentation, I'm a happy person.
Beautiful. It's been an honor talking to you. Thank you for taking the time, especially at a time where you've got some stuff on the plate that you've got to deal with. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and I would sure like to do. I hope you can do this again with me. I'm going to read some of your books, and I'd love to do it again on some non-UFO topics because you're a fascinating person.
Well, thank you. I am very grateful for this opportunity. It was a great time, and anytime,
Beautiful.
anytime.
And say hi to Peter. What's your relationship to Peter? Do you live near him or whatever, or interact
Peter,
with him quite a bit?
which Peter?
Peter Robbins?
Oh, we're only a couple hours away, but yes, we always run into each other in convention thing. He's just a sweetheart. He's just recently helped me with some journals involving Hudson Valley from the 70s. So he's a great guy. And Peter, if you're watching, hello.
He'll be watching it. Thank you very much. Fascinating, and I'm honored to talk to you.
Thank you. Same here. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.